Vote for Pedro.
A 1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to another episode of A Very Odd Caster. Now, it is an election week, and that means that we had to obtain a waiver on our no politics policy. So, no electrical shocks today, and thus no further colics. So normally when someone gets into partisan politics and stuff, you'll hear this. But not today. Because coming up here in a few days is yet another election. Oh, I can't wait. I've never been a particularly political person. I mean, it took me a long time to even register to vote. I'm one of those people. And I've got, really good friends on both ends of the spectrum. Some of them make a lot of good points, and some of them are a little loopy. But, I found myself not quite in the middle because I have a perspective. But I just find that in this day and age, it serves no purpose to be dwelling on the differences. And besides, we're here to talk about goofy stuff. But it is an election week, so we're going to talk just a little bit about sort of the environment in which we find ourselves in. So the other thing is that political comedy these days is just sort of a no-go. I used to love political comedy. I used to love all the impressions people did over the years. And I go obviously way, way back to Rich Little, for example, doing a killer Richard Nixon. It was great. But at the same time, Little also did a mean impression, as I recall, of Hubert Humphrey, who most of you younger folks don't remember, but he was Nixon's not his first opponent. He was his first opponent when Nixon won in '68. He talked kind of like this. And, but Rich Little, he nailed everybody. And, and everybody laughed on both sides. And then, we get into the 70s and Saturday Night Live came along. And of course, Chevy Chase, who was really only on the show the first year, made a household name for himself making fun of Gerald Ford's clumsiness. Ford used to get off of the airplanes and he'd wave and he'd bonk his head or he'd trip just for a second. He wouldn't fall, but it was kind of ironic with Ford, by the way, because Ford actually was a star football player at the University of Michigan. He waited until he became president to start tripping over things. But anyhow, Chevy used to open the show with all his pratfalls making fun of President Ford, and it was hysterical. And even though Chevy was far left and later on actually admitted he was trying to get Jimmy Carter elected over Ford, he didn't get the sense that Chevy wanted to actually assassinate Ford, Although, come to think of it, we've never seen Chevy and Squeaky Fromm in the same room, have we? Well, anyway, then Jimmy Carter was elected president, but SNL didn't miss a beat. Aykroyd did a killer impression of Jimmy Carter, and they did it for 4 years running. And it didn't matter how Aykroyd voted. I'm sure he wasn't voting for the Republicans. He was a comic. and he did a great Jimmy Carter. And Johnny Carson, of course, who graced the airwaves for 30 some years or whatever it was. 25 years? I think it was 25 years. Anyhow, did a lot of impersonations. Of course, he did a really good Reagan impersonation. And of course, Johnny was a staunch Dem, but he never veered from what his job was. He was a comedian. He was an entertainer, and to go out and kind of, give the finger to half your potential audience. A, it doesn't make much business sense, obviously, but B, I don't know. I mean, you're either an entertainer or you're not, right? And then we got to the 1980s and or later in the 80s, I guess it was. And then Dana Carvey came along on SNL and obviously did one of the greatest impressions ever, George Bush the First. That became Carvey's calling card. In fact, I think he went to the well one too often eventually. But anyhow, that's another story. But it was hysterical, and both sides loved it, right? There was no undertone of violence there when Carvey did his George Bush. In fact, I think Bush and Carvey appeared together at a couple of public events, and Carvey would skewer him with his impressions, and Bush took it in stride, or whatever, But then something happened. Something happened between Dana Carvey doing George Bush the First and Alec Baldwin doing Trump. Baldwin's impression was lights out, and when he first rolled it out, it was great and everything. But after a while, it didn't take long, you definitely got the sense that, Baldwin was in full John Hinckley mode, and maybe that instead of going to the post-show cast party, he was camping outside the Trump Tower, waiting for his chance to get rid of Trump, so to speak. Not that Alec knows anything about firearms. Ooh. That was a low blow. Couldn't resist, though. But Alec, I'm sorry. If you and the other 3 people out there are watching, my bad. So now we have here in the year 2022, political comedy essentially is just about dead. SNL, I don't know what they're doing. And each side does their own thing. You don't see SNL doing a lot of stuff on the current president, who kind of makes Jerry Ford look like a ballet dancer and a poet in comparison. So anyhow, that's kind of where we're at. It's evolved from kind of a bipartisan thing to something pretty disturbing. And that's why we have usually decided to go with a no politics rule here on A Very Oddcaster. And of course, if you're in violation of that rule, you get this. But today we've got a waiver because next week there is an election. And that's pretty much all that's going on right now, right? So of course this is an off-year election, which means we're not voting for president, which makes the previous segment here talking about comedy and presidents totally redundant, doesn't it? But anyhow, you'll see a lot of stuff saying, go out and vote. Your vote counts, blah, 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 blah. I'm not one of those people that bug other people to vote. If you truly think the candidates stink, and they usually do, you're well within your right to say no, But at the same time, you can only say so much later, right? When everything's going to hell in a handbasket or whatever the saying is. So, but I'm not one of those that push that. It is usually the lesser of two evils. It's like either you dance with the devil that you know, or you go stick a pitchfork in that devil, figuratively speaking. Not literally. We would let Alec Baldwin handle that. Not again. But it is the season, and you can tell that because everywhere you turn, you see signs. Everywhere there's signs. Sounds like a good theme for a song. The original thinker has another idea. But you see signs everywhere. And I was driving out in the Virginia countryside, and I saw a sign along the country road. I started seeing signs, actually, that said, "Elect Hung Cow for president." An Asian name, And, I realized that, trans topics are all the rage these days, but how do you get a hung cow exactly? So, driving along further, I started to see other signs that said, "Farmers for hung cow." Whew. Now, what kind of farmers are these anyhow? I don't know. So I don't know anything about Virginia politics, and no disrespect to Mr. Cow. Mr. Hung. Dude that's hung like a cow, except cows aren't hung, except for their udders. Never. Anyway, but, just as long as it's not like that bestiality case several years ago out in Washington State, where that weirdo was like bringing in other weirdos to, meet his horse. Ooh, that just that that definitely wasn't your papa's Wilbur. And so if you're like me, you don't know much about some of these, as they call them, down ballot candidates that are running for these local offices. You don't really know that much about them. You go into the booth to vote, and there's all these names. You're like, what the hell is this? And if you have that sensation, and I've had that many times, you almost think that maybe I shouldn't be in here voting, right? I don't know who these people are. At first, I just sort of went, eeny, meeny, miny, moe, catch a politician by the tongue. And then I just picked people. And actually, for a while, I was splitting the ballot. It's like, well, I don't know this person, but he's a Democrat, and I've been voting the other way, so I'll vote Democrat. So that's just an example. So I would vote split ticket when I first started voting because I didn't know anything about these local races. And that sort of dawned on me like, what the hell are you doing? You shouldn't be voting if you don't know anything about this, right? So I started leaving things blank. That's was my evolution. Yeah, in a perfect world, I would read up on everything and anything. But a lot of it doesn't directly affect the voter. A lot of it does, but a lot of it doesn't. So maybe ignorance is bliss. I don't know. But all this talk about voting and making informed votes and making uninformed votes reminds me of another stupid-ass thing from my childhood. So this barely makes it into my childhood. This goes back to my senior year in high school. And I graduated from a pretty dysfunctional class of misfits and contrarians and eccentrics. Whereas, most classes would elect one of their best and brightest for their class president. My class decided to go the Pedro route. My class elected this somewhat nerdy, extremely quiet guy named Zebo, who had like a 2.1 GPA and about 1.5 friends, in the entire school. I'm exaggerating. And Zebo's nickname was Gazebo, because I think he was about as animated as a gazebo. And the other two candidates running for class president had all the usual credentials. They belonged to every club in the school, the debate team, this, that. One of them was on the football team. They were both very good students and good-looking guys who kind of dressed the part, very preppy and whatnot. And of course, the other thing those two guys had in common was they really, really, really wanted to be class president. I mean, this was their moment, right? And on the contrary, the last thing on earth that Zebo the Gazebo wanted to be was class president. He went along with the joke, though, because it doubled his friend base. I'm exaggerating. So as a joke, the class gave Zebo the Gazebo 70% of the popular vote. And one of the runners-up tried to argue that we should be using the Electoral College to elect our class presidents. But nobody knew what the fuck he was talking about. So Zebo the Gazebo became class president Zebo the Gazebo. And then after all the laughter died down and people went back about their business, poor Zebo became very miserable. Now he actually had to do shit. He had to help organize the prom, the prom which he hadn't planned on attending. And then all sorts of other administrative and symbolic duties as class pres. And poor Zebo was so overwhelmed that he tried to resign as class president several times, but the mob wouldn't let him. Sound familiar? They picketed outside his house, and his mother, Mrs. Zebo the Gazebo, who was just as quiet as her son, was horrified at all the noise down on the street. "Don't let us down! Don't let us down!" they chanted on and on and on. I didn't take part in this protest activity, you see, because I was at home listening to my Pink Floyd album with my headphones on. Yeah, that's what I was doing. Ultimately, under severe peer pressure, Zebo the Gazebo agreed to serve out the remainder of his term as class president, and upon graduation was never heard from again. Others were left to run things like the Alumni Foundation and organize class reunions that ended in zero. Not Zebo, zero. But at any rate, this was one of many experiences that sort of turned me off to the whole idea of politics, even at this very early level. And it was also one of the stupid things from my childhood. Now, I want to call your attention to this picture here. You've got a bunch of college students at some unnamed school in the United States of America. And they all look happy and everything. It's a very diverse group. And you know how upset college kids get over everything. They get offended over everything, right? But you notice that a couple of these college kids are flashing rabbit ears behind the heads of their classmates. Now, what if some people found rabbit ears offensive, huh? What are we going to do about that? All right, I admit it. I'm offended by rabbit ears because I identify as a rabbit. Now, if you'll excuse me. I was deeply saddened to hear of Jerry Lee Lewis's passing. He was truly a pioneer in show business, one of a kind, really. And he had a very controversial personal life, of course. But, he was one of the most colorful characters in entertainment history, and the world is definitely going to miss him, and I'll miss him. I never missed a single one of his telethons, for example. And, The Nutty Professor, that was one of the best movies I ever... Oh, Jerry Lee Lewis. Okay. Oh, Great Balls of Fire. Anyhow, I like Jerry Lee Lewis even better. He was awesome. Greatest rock and roll piano player of all time, bar none. And I say that as a huge Billy Joel and Elton John fan. Jerry Lee was simply possessed when he was tickling those ivories. And like Hendrix on the guitar, it's like he was toying with the piano keys. It's amazing. It really was amazing. There was no match for him. And a few years ago, he was in his 80s, he was playing in Atlantic City. I almost jumped in the car to go watch him. I should have. I had some other obligations. I couldn't do it. But, man, one of a kind. And R.I.P. Jerry Lee. And now we'll turn to the world of sports. There's a lot going on in sports. Just last night, the Houston Astros, 4 pitchers threw only the second no-hitter in World Series history, beating the Phillies 5-0, I think it was, to tie that series at 2 games apiece. The day before, the Phillies rolled for 7 runs, and the Phillies have been unstoppable. It's funny because when I was watching that game and the Phillies were destroying them, and I was thinking, so many times, because I used to coach baseball, a team scores a ton of runs and they blow out the other team. And then the very next game, they can't hit their way out of a wet paper bag. And I remember thinking about that. I wonder if they'll go cold now, was my subconscious thought. But I wasn't thinking like no hit cold, But anyhow, that was pretty wild. I don't care much who wins that series. Phillies are an underdog though, because they had the worst record of any playoff team, and they've just been unstoppable. So I kind of want them. Houston, they would have done themselves favors not to cheat so much. But otherwise, I don't have a problem with them. So do I have a prediction on that series? There's 1 game left in Philly. There's 2 games left in Houston. I think Philly's going to do it. You heard it here, folks. And over in the NFL, the trade deadline came and went. And there were some interesting moves. The Ravens got a good linebacker from the Bears. The Bears sent somebody else somewhere. I'm getting confused on some of the specifics of the trades. Kansas City shipped off a cornerback, I think. And so now things are lining up. We're just about at the halfway point. And boy, my preseason predictions have been blown out of the water, at least at some point. I did predict a drop-off for the 2 Super Bowl teams from last year, the Bengals and the Rams. The Rams certainly are struggling big time. And the Bengals are kind of inconsistent, and the Browns beat the living crap out of them on Monday Night Football. And so things are sort of sliding into place. The Ravens are a flawed team, but they're in first place. I did have them winning the division. I don't want them to win the division. Sorry, neighbors. But I think they're going to do it. Right now, though, you have 3 good teams only in the NFL. The Buffalo Bills, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Philadelphia Eagles. And out of those 3, Buffalo and KC seems to me to be the best. Philly, I'm not sold on yet. And I need to look a little closer at who they've played. But they play in a real mediocre division. I know the Giants have a good record, but like I said, they play in a mediocre division. They're improved, but no. So I'm just not quite sold on Philly doing it. I think maybe they're one of these teams that's peaking in the first part of the year, and then come the playoffs, it'll be another story. But at the same time, the NFC doesn't seem to have much going for it. Green Bay, who's my favorite NFC team, doesn't look like they have it, And the Tom Brady-led Buccaneers, I always said, once he hits the end of the line, it's going to be like off a cliff. And you can't really say that he's going off a cliff. He might feel that way because he's going through a lot of shit in his life, But it looks like the whole team aged 20 years since last season. They look very, very beatable. And I had them winning the NFC South. And they still might, because that division sucks too. I mean, there's just so much mediocrity in the NFL, and that certainly makes Goodell happy, but I don't know. But we've only got 3 more games, my fellow Clevelanders, until a certain quarterback comes off the suspension list. And at that time, we will adopt not the terrible towels, but the shower towels to serenade Deshaun Watson's debut. So we're going to close out with a few other news stories here. Elon Musk, of course, has officially bought Twitter, where people are so nice to each other. So I think censorship will go out the door there, and that's a good thing. Because I'm all about free speech, and obviously Elon's all about free speech because he's charging, $8 a month now for people to get their check mark. So why do you need a check mark? Anyhow, there's another story, this NBC News. There's a study going on to determine whether magic mushrooms can treat severe depression. Oh shit. They're about to find me out. And lastly, this story, the headline says, avian flu outbreak. Thousands of turkeys culled in Lancashire, which is a county in England. Thousands of turkeys have been culled at a farm in Lancashire as part of the government's fight against avian flu. A total of 4,000 birds were culled at Woods Farm in Littlehoole, South Ribble on Tuesday. 4,000 turkeys in Blackburn, Lancashire. All right, that's it for us for this week. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to send an email, please send it to veryoddcaster@gmail.com. That's veryoddcaster@gmail.com. Vote early, vote often, vote with your toenails. Good day.
Walking high, fisted combat, crawling in the trenches, how they hide from the wenches of Pendlebury. Do you know what I'm talking about?
you.